Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining today's call. As some of you may know who have been with us for the last few weeks, this call is the fourth and final call in a four-part series that was designed to discuss Prosperity Now's 2021 policy priorities, to discuss those priorities with our Prosperity Now community, talk a little bit about what those policies mean for your own communities, and then most of all, to hear from you about what you're doing either at the state, local, or federal level with regards to these issues, and just to see how our issues align with what you're currently working on in your states. As you can see, today's webinar, our final webinar, will focus on our consumer protections priorities. So that is what we will talk about today. And just a little insight into what we've already discussed. We started the series on January 26th and talking about our tax priorities. February 9th, we talked about our financial security priorities. 2 weeks ago, we talked about our affordable home ownership priorities. And like I said, today we'll focus on consumer protections. If you all would like more information about any of those other sessions that we had, they all were recorded, as is this session. So I'll let you know this will be recorded and will be made available after today's call. But we do have a link to those previous videos. So just let us know and we will we'll get you a copy of any session that you may have missed. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items with you all. First and foremost, as I mentioned, the call is being recorded and we will make this available to you all after the call. We'll send out an email with links to all of our previously recorded sessions. All attendees are muted to ensure sound quality, but we don't want you all to feel like you can't chime into the discussion. Much like the other three calls that we did, we want these calls to feel interactive, which is why we're calling them calls and not webinars. We want you all to feel free to speak up and talk about what you're working on in your state and your communities. And we also want you to utilize the chat box. If you're not comfortable speaking up and unmuting yourself, feel free to utilize the chat box. Share your thoughts anytime by typing into the chat box. And you can see there, if this is your first week joining us, how to unmute yourself. We've circled it for you there in red, as well as how to utilize the chat box, the raise my hand option, so on and so forth. So please feel free to engage. We love it that way. Not only engage with us, but engage with other advocates on the call. One of the great things about these calls is that we've been able to make some good connections. If you see another organization that's working on something similar to you, we've made those types of connections. So that's really what we want to get out of this series. And then lastly, if you're not already following Prosperity Now on Twitter, please do so. That's our Twitter handle there. Follow us following this call. And then in terms of today's speakers, myself, as well as Anju Chopra, who is our senior policy manager. Anju handles both our affordable homeownership portfolio as well as our consumer protections portfolio. So you heard from Anju 2 weeks ago. You will hear from her again here momentarily. And then today's agenda, the welcome, which I've just given you. In just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Anju to dive into Prosperity Now's 2021 consumer protections priorities. After that, we will open up the floor for just a general discussion. I've got some discussion questions that I would like to pose to you all, just to kind of guide the conversation. But we really want to hear from you all about what you're working on, any questions that you have, any support that Prosperity Now can provide to you all. And then we'll talk next steps and how to get involved from there. So with that, I will turn it over to Anju to kick us off in talking about our 2021 consumer protections priorities.
Thank you, Vanna. Hold on one second. Great. So you can go to the next slide. Cool. So good afternoon, everyone. Before I discuss our consumer protections priorities for this year, I wanted to remind everyone of why protecting consumers is so important. In 2020, during the pandemic, the CFPB's complaint database received more than 444,000 complaints, which is more than 50% higher than the year before. This is the most complaints the database has ever received. The significant increase over the last year underscores how vulnerable households are during a crisis and the need for protections. But with that said, even when there isn't an emergency like COVID, there are predatory products and bad financial actors taking advantage of consumers. The number of complaints in pre-pandemic 2019, though not as high as 2020, were still high. In fact, 2019 set a record for number of complaints registered before 2020. So not only are there quite a few complaints about financial products and practices, they appear to be increasing. In terms of the most common complaints, according to the CFPB, credit reporting is the most complained about issue, with debt collection practices being the second most common consumer complaint. In terms of debt collection, the Bureau finalized a rule late last year to regulate the third-party debt collection industry, which refers to people who collect on original debt. Unfortunately, it misses the mark on a number of fronts. First, it allows debt collectors to attempt to contact consumers about a debt by phone 7 times a week for each debt, meaning if someone has more than one debt in collections, attempts could be made to contact them 2 or 3 dozen times each week, if not more. For electronic communications about debt, if consumers don't want to receive them, they must take the step of opting out of receiving these messages. And there's no limit to the number of electronic messages that can be sent by collectors. There's also no outright prohibition on collecting debt that is so old that it's no longer outstanding debt by law and therefore entitled to be collected. Next slide. At the same time, under former Director Kathy Kraninger's leadership at the Bureau from 2018 until recently, enforcement actions dropped off, particularly in terms of the amount of restitution received from unfair or deceptive financial practices. For example, when Richard Cordray was director of the Bureau during Obama's presidency, the most money received as punishment from bad actors or was put back in the hands of consumers was during 2015, when the amount of restitution was around $6 billion. Compare this to Kraninger, where the most awarded in 1 year during her tenure was around $783 million, which is obviously significantly less restitution. Next slide. I also wanted to remind people of just how predatory financial products can be. Payday lending is a prime example and one that Prosperity Now has advocated against for years. This industry deliberately traps consumers in loans they can't afford, leading to a high percentage of loan rollovers. The average interest rate for these products is in the triple digits, and interest payments often exceed the amount owed for the original loan amount. A rule was passed in 2017 when Cordray was still director of the Bureau that would have done much to rein in some of the most predatory aspects of this industry, including requiring lenders to determine whether a consumer could actually afford the loan, what's referred to as the ability to repay standard, before extending them one. During Kraninger's tenure, unfortunately, the core elements of the rule were repealed, which includes the ability to repay mandate. Next slide. So given this background, we wanted to share Prosperity Now's federal consumer protections priorities for 2021. First, now that Kathy Kraninger has stepped down as director of the CFPB, we would like to see President Biden's nominee for director, Rohit Chopra, confirmed by the Senate. Rohit has a history of consumer advocacy and would be more supportive of the Bureau's mission. Our second priority is the need for more enforcement by the Bureau. As we mentioned, enforcement has become lax under Trump-appointed Bureau leadership, that being former interim director Mick Mulvaney and then former director Kraninger. Also under Trump leadership, the Office of Fair Lending was stripped of its supervision and enforcement powers, with attorneys with fair lending expertise reassigned to other offices, thus shifting the focus away from stamping out discriminatory practices. Given last year's focus on racial inequities and Prosperity Now's own commitment to narrowing the racial wealth gap, we would like to see supervision and enforcement powers returned to the Office of Fair Lending, and for there to be just more enforcement capacity earmarked for fair lending actions overall. We also want to see Dodd-Frank Section 1071 finally implemented. This section requires lenders making business loans to report on the race, sex, and ethnicity of borrowers. This information is critical to understanding whether minority-owned and other underserved businesses are receiving the capital they need to launch and grow their businesses. And finally, we'd like payday lending and debt collections regulations to be strengthened. This includes reinstating the ability to repay standard for payday loans. It also includes capping the number of attempted phone calls by debt collectors to 3 times a week per consumer rather than 7 times a week per debt. We also want consumers to be able to opt into receiving electronic communications rather than opting out. And we would also like to see an outright ban on time-barred or old debt. Next slide. So the good news is that we now have leadership that is more supportive of many of these priorities. The current interim director of the Bureau has prioritized the enforcement of protections related to predatory COVID practices, as well as the importance of racial equity. He's also stated his intention to reverse policies that have weakened enforcement and supervision over the past few years. And he's going to prioritize the implementation of Dodd-Frank Section 1071. In addition to that, Rohit Chopra said during his Senate confirmation hearing last week that he did intend to ramp up enforcement, as well as acknowledging the importance of fair lending. Going forward, Prosperity Now will be holding the Bureau accountable for making good on these promises, as well as pushing for more robust payday and debt collection regulations, among other consumer safety issues. And there's now reason to be optimistic that, some or many of these changes could actually be enacted. So that's the good news. I wanted to leave off on a positive note. Back to you, Vanna.
Perfect. Thank you, Anju, for that overview. And I know that you talked about some of our priorities at Prosperity Now being to hold the Bureau accountable and seeing some of our core and key issues, seeing them through issues of payday lending, debt collection, and wanted to let folks know on the call, similar to what we've done before on consumer protections, there will be opportunities for you all as our network to chime in and help us advance these issues through things like signing on to comment letters, just getting involved in regulatory advocacy as these things start to come about throughout the next 2 years. So we will be keeping you all posted on, what's moving and how you all can get involved. But like I said, mostly through signing on, submitting comments to the Bureau, and just really having a strong advocacy push in that way. So with that, I want to hear from folks on the call. I know that that was a pretty quick overview of what we're focused on, but I wanted to open it up to you all for a broader discussion on consumer protections in your community. And I have a couple questions that I'm going to pose to you all as discussion questions. Or if you have more specific questions for Anju on our policy priorities, feel free to either type those into the chat box or unmute yourself and ask them aloud. But some of the discussion questions here, what consumer protection challenges are you seeing in your state or community? What are some of the issues? What are some of the ways that you see these consumer protections issues showing up in your community? How is payday lending impacting your community? How is unfair debt collection practices showing up in your community? So if you want to chime in and just let us know what you all are seeing in your state or community. What consumer protections issues are you prioritizing this year within your advocacy or policy priorities portfolio? If consumer protections is there, what issues are you working on? What resources or supports do you need from Prosperity Now for your own consumer-related advocacy? Let us know how we can be helpful. And then lastly, would it be helpful for us to do similar calls as this, just strategic planning calls as things begin to move within the CFPB in the coming months and years? Would more calls like this be helpful for us to relay information for you, or would just simple emails or an online tracker be helpful for you? So yes, I want to open up the floor now. Again, if you have questions for Anju or just feedback on some of these discussion questions, we would love to hear them from you. And if you would, in addition to utilizing the chat box, if someone else is speaking and you would like to speak up, just click the raise my hand icon and we'll call on you in that order. So I will give you all a few seconds just to kind of chew on things and think of questions that you may have for Anju. And I saw that, Joanna, you posted another question. And Rada, I think you had just unmuted yourself as I did. So I'll get to you in a second. But I see, Joanna, you posted a question in the chat box. How do these complaints overlap with what you're seeing on the ground in your community? So if anyone wants to answer that as well. But go ahead, Rada.
Hi, Vanna. Good to see you. We at Saver Life, we are really interested in consumer protections with our member base. We have low and moderate incomes and low and moderate income individuals and households who are often underbanked, and so they are using payday lending. It's an issue we follow closely. And Lee is also on the Consumer Advisory Committee of CFPB. So this is thank you for hosting this webinar. It's really helpful for us. I have a question for Anju. And that is, what state level priorities or state level advocacy actions are you seeing, or even local ones, if any, or maybe that's you're hoping to get more information about that in this call. And we find these monthly calls or periodic calls really helpful, so we would love to continue engaging that way.
First of all, thank you so much. It's great to hear that you're finding these calls useful. I actually, my colleague Holden probably has some thoughts about some of the consumer protections priorities at the state and local level that are currently moving. Holden, if you want to chime in, please do. But in the while we're waiting for Holden, I do want to acknowledge that even with the payday lending rules, hitting a snag, shall we say, during the Kraninger directorship. There are states that have 36% interest rate caps. So there is some movement at the state level to deal with predatory payday lending. Just reminding folks that when there's a vacuum at the federal level, things do happen at the state and local level. With that, Holden, do you have any thoughts that you might want to share about state and local consumer protections advocacy and priorities?
Sure. I mean, the only thing that I would just kind of reinforce what you were already saying is a lot of what we were seeing is really focused on rate caps. That's been largely what we've been tracking this for the most part these sessions that are going on right now. There are a lot of them, actually, a lot of bills being introduced, some of which have recently passed, so that's good to see. I believe there were actually a couple of referenda in the last election that passed as well. So it's good to see that trend is continuing. I haven't been looking into some of the other areas that's been discussed so far, but we are certainly monitoring what's popping up.
Thanks, Holden. And I know that I see that Joanna just posted our state policy priorities into the chat box. So feel free to take a look at that. And I don't think Holden mentioned it, but our scorecard also tracks kind of what states have payday and, correct me if I'm wrong, debt collection protections in our Prosperity Now scorecard. I don't think we updated this piece over the last several months, but that gives you an idea of what states have some sort of coverage when it comes to when it comes to payday lending.
Yeah, the other thing I would also want to chime in as far as priorities, I know that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau recently released a publication about some research they were doing on how many households could actually be, run into rental snags or evictions, post COVID. And I think they were saying it was around 11 million households that could be. So Rohit Chopra was also stating that a priority would be in the housing space as well, to make sure that they stave off any sort of housing crisis that could, potentially be as devastating as what we saw in 2008.
Thank you. I see another question here from Pat in the chat box. Has anyone had issues with predatory lending practices from tribal payday lenders? I have a client who has an interest in excess of 200%, which is the first time I have come across this level of usury. So I will pose that question to not only Anju or Holden, if you have thoughts there, but other folks on the call, other advocates, other folks who are doing payday related issues. If you all are having or seeing things specifically as it relates to tribal payday lenders, feel free to chime in there.
Yeah, and while we're waiting for folks, Vanna, I would say that that definitely is an issue, and if someone on the call right now is not doesn't have that level of expertise, we could certainly circle back and try to make those connections with people where other people who maybe are not on the call right now are facing similar issues.
All right, just pausing for a moment to see if others wanted to chime in there. And Pat, that's a great question and great point. And if there are some folks in our Prosperity Now community that we can connect you with who have been doing specifically working on tribal consumer protections, we can do that offline. Thanks for the question. Any other questions for Anju, or answers or responses to some of the discussion questions that we've posed to you all here? Don't want to feel like we, don't want to pressure anyone to speak up, but again, want to feel like this is a good discussion for you all, for you all not only to learn our priorities, but to kind of pick each other's brains and see what other organizations are working on across the country.
And I would also say, Vanna, again, as we're waiting, if any of what I said was too weedy, I'm happy to, to clarify anything. A lot of our consumer protections work does focus on the CFPB. It was more defensive over the last few years, but I think the point that I was trying to make at the end of my discussion about consumer protections is that there is reason to be more optimistic that, that the CFPB will actually be the cop on the beat that it's supposed to be. And, it's going to be our role to make sure that they, make good on their promises to do that, both in terms of payday lending and debt collection and other areas, that are a concern for us and for people in our network.
And Anju, question for you, and I was going to type this into the chat box while you were presenting earlier, but the jump between 2019 and 2020 in terms of complaints to the CFPB was significant. I think like anybody who saw that number was shocked, but maybe not really, because of, COVID and everyone just kind of grasping at everything, with the difficult year that we all had last year. But what type, do you have any sense of what types of complaints those were? Are there organizations who have collected that information? I know the CFPB probably has information on that, but I was just curious about some examples of like what were the big complaints that they were seeing.
Yeah, if you go back, Vanna, to like the first slide and look at the pie chart on the right, you can actually see the first slide of the one where I was talking. There you go. So these complaints in 2019 pretty much mirror the ones in 2020, except the numbers are off. So credit reporting is the #1 complaint. In 2019, it accounted for about 44% of the complaints. In 2020, it actually shot up to around 63%, and that includes complaints about the big 3 credit agencies, TransUnion, Equifax, et cetera. Debt collection, again, is another really big source of complaints, but there are also a lot for credit cards and mortgages as well. And I know these are just the Bureau numbers. They don't actually include the numbers from the Federal Trade Commission and the kinds of complaints that they're getting as well. So there's a possibility that those numbers could shift a bit. But this does, in terms of recording, this is very common. Debt collection is always up there. Credit reporting is always up there. Credit cards are not uncommon as well. A lot of it's about inaccuracy as well. I think that's another point to be made. But yeah, in terms of the shift to 2020, I mean, I think there are 2 things that are worth noting about that. The fact that it skyrocketed under COVID is really no surprise to anyone, I would imagine. But the fact that 2019 had also shattered records before 2020 is noteworthy as well. Now, is that related to the fact that enforcement was more lax at the CFPB over the past few years? We can't causally say that, but there certainly is a correlation there between stepping back, less restitution, less enforcement by the Bureau, and then an increasing number of complaints also. Like I said, there's no causation there, but there is a correlation, and it does make you wonder.
Thank you for clarifying that. And I see, Shira, you had a similar question that you posted in the chat. As well as a comment, although the issues people are complaining about is bad, I am happy to see that awareness is building of the CFPB and people see it as a resource for helping with issues. Absolutely. And hopefully over the next several weeks as the new director gets confirmed, we will continue trending in that direction. And then I see, Joanna, you asked the question here, and I'm just going to read it aloud. Does the fact and figures Anju shared line up with what you all have seen in your states? And that's what we're kind of wondering on the call is what are some of the things that you all are seeing in the states, maybe that we haven't mentioned as it relates to consumer protections. We'd love that kind of information as we further develop our consumer protections priorities throughout the next 2 years. All right, hearing nothing. Well, I am going to move us along. It doesn't sound like we have a lot of questions or comments, which is okay. We figured discussion might not go as long on this call as some of the other calls. It's the 4th one in a series, so I'm just appreciative that you all have hung on with us for these last several weeks. But I'll move us along to just sort of talk next steps or just how you all can get involved, similar to what we talked about on previous calls. As these issues come about, if there is legislation that relates to any of our consumer protections priorities, they'll be uploaded into our federal policy tracker online. So feel free to just go there as a place, as a resource for you all to see how these issues are moving, to see what legislators are supportive of them, and just get more information on the bills themselves. So that's on Prosperity Now's federal policy website. Invite you all to check that out throughout the year to just see how these things are moving. And then also, I always plug this on every one of these calls, but our Prosperity Now Advocacy Center is open to you. As I mentioned, as we push for stricter regulations around payday lending, around debt collection, opportunities are going to arise throughout the year for us to submit comments to the CFPB, to sign on to letters. We do all of that through our Prosperity Now Advocacy Center. So feel free to go in there and email, call, tweet, or schedule a meeting with your legislator. But you all will see alerts and things from our Prosperity Now Advocacy Center as we push for sign-ons, push for comments and things like that over the next couple of months. Uh-oh, I am getting mixed up here. And then wanted to leave Anju's contact information for you all. I know, like I said, Anju was with us two weeks ago to discuss our affordable home ownership priorities. But if you have questions about either those or our consumer protections priorities, feel free to email her or myself. Our email addresses are there on the screen for you.
Oh.
Sorry, Anju, were you going to say something?
Oh yeah, sorry. No, just really quickly. Yeah, please get in touch. I mean, if we want to know not only, if you've got clarifying questions for us, but, if you have thoughts about your own consumer protections issues from your sightline at the state and local level, we always want to know what's happening, more locally as well, so that we, can align those with our federal priorities and keep the conversation going.
Thank you for that, Anju. And then just those resources that I posed on the discussion questions slide of what resources and materials we can provide from Prosperity Now to help you further advance your priorities would be helpful. So feel free to reach out to us for that as well. And then lastly, just in terms of next steps, usually this would read to join us in 2 more weeks for our next call, but this is the end of the series. So again, just visit our advocacy center, reach out to Anju or myself if you have additional questions, and we will gladly help you. So I'm going to pause for a second to see if anyone has any last minute questions or comments or anything. If not, I will wrap us up.
Hey there. I just want to chime in again. Another issue that we're following closely is the student loan debt. We know there are a few more months left, but this is an issue that's affects many folks and is a real barrier to economic mobility among our members. That's an issue we're following closely.
And Rada, we might actually be doing some federal advocacy on student loan debt. We are in conversation with some other national partners about a separate federal bill to actually consider advocating for. We've got 3 priorities that we're trying to sort of focus on in terms of introduction. It's different from the loan forgiveness discussions. It's very specifically really tied to entrepreneurship as well. So stay tuned for that. We should be having some communications about that in the future.
Thank you, Anju. Any other questions? Not hearing anything. I will just wrap us up. Thank you all for joining us for these last several weeks. I hope that these calls have been helpful for you all in terms of what our priorities are, how we can be helpful to you. Feel free, don't hesitate to email either Anju or myself if you have additional questions. But with that, you all have a great rest of your day, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.